the Founders Foyer with me, Aishwarya. This foyer is full of conversations. The space where creators, founders, and builders look for all the supported concepts to grow their ideas into products. All of us love listening to stories from friends, teammates, sometimes even strangers we meet. What makes us a good listener also pushes us to share our experiences and thoughts as stories. But when it comes to storytelling, there's a ton of questions that could cloud us. What to share, what would keep us relevant with our audience? And why would somebody be interested in our story even? But great stories are crafted, unforgettable, and uniquely associated with the person who shares. So let's dive deeper to understand what's the magic behind every story and how can we become good storytellers. I've got Matthew Dix, the best-selling author, columnist, blogger, podcaster, and a teacher. Matt has started clients like the FBI, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Salesforce, Harvard, and Lego to tell the best stories. He's a creator, producer, and co host of the Speak Up Storytelling podcast. And he's also authored the most famous book, Storyworthy, which has received so much appreciation among the tech folks. Hi, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm so happy to be here.
Awesome. Matt, why don't we start with what brought you into this journey of telling stories? What have you discovered after being a storyteller for so many years? And especially, I remember that you once told me you teach the fifth graders now too. So, is there something that you keep learning from them after so many years?
I do, I've been doing it for a while now. I mean, I guess I've been doing it since I was a little kid. I never really recognized it, as something that I cared about when I was a child. But, when I was 11 or 12 years old, I went and saw Steven Spielberg's movie E.T. And I remember being so upset about that movie. There's a scene in it that I think is just a
Mm-hmm.
disaster. Even today, I think it's a disastrous scene. It breaks the movie in a way. And when I
Mm-hmm.
came home as a kid, I wrote a letter to Spielberg telling him how bad this scene was and how in all of his movies, I love them, but they always seem to have this moment that ruins it for me. So I offered to have him send the movie to me first so I could tell him about all the stupid parts. So even as a kid, I was sort of deconstructing stories in a way I didn't quite understand. It wasn't until 2011 that I actually took a stage and started performing and telling stories. And I thought for
Mm-hmm.
a long time I was just going to be that guy who stood on stages and made people laugh and cry. And that would be the extent of what I did. And then eventually, someone in business heard me telling stories and asked me to come into his company and help him, perhaps tell better stories. I didn't really think I could. I didn't see that as a path for me, but he was right
Right.
and I was wrong. And it's led to all of this. So yeah, I think I still learn every day. I think I learn from both listening to people tell stories and figuring out what they're doing well and what they're not doing well. And
Mm-hmm.
also, one of the best ways to learn is to sort of have to look at what you do and
Mm-hmm.
deconstruct it for others. I used to tell stories, and the things that I had learned over time as a novelist and a public speaker and just being a human being, I couldn't really quantify them, for other
Mm-hmm.
people. But when folks started asking me to teach them, then I had to sort of deconstruct my process and see the things that
Right.
I was doing so that I could teach other people to do them. And I'm always doing that every day as well. So yeah, it's a constant process.
Yeah, absolutely. I like how you drew parallels to movies and scripts and then brought it back to storytelling because a lot of times things that we pick and observe from our childhood and things that have like a very, very strong influence on us turns out to be like the right way to perhaps kindle our interest towards something. And yes, your friend and the person who spotted was like extremely right because I guess storytelling was never like a very stereotypical path. Like it was like people didn't discover what stories could do to their brands and could do to their business. But I'm actually very glad that you found that road, and which is what we're going to be discussing about today too. But it's quite a very different background and a very very nice story behind that to get into storytelling, I guess.
Yeah, it's certainly not expected. I often say that, there are people who have plans in life. They
Right.
graduate school, they go to college, they go to graduate school, they become the thing they wanted to be. For me, it was very much not that, kicked out at
Mm.
sort of 18 years old, having to live on my own. It's been a different kind of a path and a path of more self-discovery than anything else, but it's been a good one.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, Matt, you as a kid got very interested with stories, but how is it to deal with kids of today? You teach fifth graders and you also teach corporate clients to tell good stories. So, is there like a similarity or how different it is? What's keeping you excited or what's different in both of these that you observe?
I think the surprising thing is there isn't very much different. There's often
Mhm.
a perception when I'm working with corporate clients that there's storytelling for business and then personal storytelling and, then storytelling for children. And it's really not true. The same
Mhm.
strategies that I use to write a novel, the same strategies that filmmakers use, the same strategies that I use to tell a story on a stage are the same strategies I use in the classroom when telling stories to students to get them to learn long division or to help a
Right.
client sell a product or, market a service. They're all the same strategies, just deployed in different
Hmm.
contexts, greater or lesser degrees, but it all is the same. So that if you're watching a movie, the things that are being done on screen, those strategies that are being used to make you laugh and cry and hold your attention and get you to sit on the edge of your seat, all of those things can also be used if you are trying to sell a product or a service. So we can pay
Right.
attention to the way people tell stories in the world, and it really can inform the work that we're trying to do in the business place.
Hmm. I guess at the end, it's like sort of bringing who you are as a person. That's like eventually how you bring to a story. So whether you're a kid or a grown up, I guess what excites you and what you bring of yourself to the table gets to be the same.
Yeah, and the strategies that you deploy, whether you're
Mhm.
10 or 60, they're the
Mhm.
same. So I can
Right.
teach a 10-year-old how to use some simple strategies to tell a better story, and
Mm.
those are exactly the same strategies I might tell a 60-year-old to apply to a pitch deck that they're showing me. It really
Right.
is essentially the same. I mean, the 10-year-olds, you have to yell at them more and tell them to sit down. And the 60-year-olds, you have to convince them that the way they've been doing business forever is not necessarily the best way, but in the end, it's all the same.
Yeah, yeah. No, I can imagine that. And because you're talking about strategizing it and you get to work with a lot of these people, one thing that I wanted to get your thoughts on was whenever we talk about stories, people immediately have a very manipulative term to it, right? They think it's something that you say to kind of sell something to them or just very markety language being shown. But what exactly is storytelling and what constitutes a good story from your experiences of working with this?
Well, what you have to understand first is what is a story. A lot of times,
Mm.
what people believe is a story is essentially reporting on your life. Something has happened
Mhm.
either in your life or in the life cycle of your product or service or your business. And I'm going to now tell you about what has happened. That's not a story. That's just sort of like a book report. And no
Yeah.
one ever wants a report. It tends to be listy and absent any of
Mm.
those things. Stories compelling. So, to understand a story, essentially it becomes your job to reflect change over time. A story is about transformation or realization. Something has changed, and as a result of that change, we are new, or we have a product, or our business has pivoted. Whatever it ends up being, it's change
Mm.
over time. Every movie you've ever seen, every book you've ever read, and any good sort of commercial, any good marketing pitch, all of them do this thing, which is reflecting change over time. And when we can do that, then we can actually move people emotionally. Otherwise, we're just talking about stuff that happened. And when we talk about stuff that happened, people don't want to listen. We have to understand
Mm.
fundamentally at core that no one wants to hear anything we have to say unless we give
Mhm.
them a reason to listen. And I don't believe most people believe that. I think most people believe that if they have a microphone or an audience or a YouTube channel or someone looking in their direction, that that person wants to listen to them. And I think the best storytellers in the world truly believe at their core that audiences are terrible people and they must be convinced relentlessly at every moment that what we are saying is worth hearing. And when we fail to do that, when we let down our guard and assume people want to hear us, that's, I think, when we fail.
Mm. Right. I can see how a lot of this relates to different facets of storytelling. I mean, as a podcaster, the same thing that you just told me right now resonates so much because if I'm just going to be thinking that, oh, like I have an audience, this episode is just going to like really work out, but I don't really instill a change. I don't really bring about a certain core concept that I believe in. I guess it's really not going to stick. And to me, it sounded more like you're actually immersing whoever is listening to you to move from state one to state two. So technically, the change is like you're taking them along with you, the story, and then making them move and sort of understand that there's something that's different here. So
Yes,
yeah,
I'm looking for relatability. My story should always, in
mm,
some way, either reflect something they have experienced or something they've seen or something that they can imagine. And the closer I can get to relatability, the more I am likely to produce an emotional response as well.
right, right, yeah. And while you're saying about this relatability, I've read about what you say in terms of the 5 second moment, right? Because you kind of say how every great story is essentially about a 5 second moment that you recognize and you make people relate to it. So can you tell us how to capture this 5 second story and like brief on it and get to convert and make it relatable with people?
Yeah. So, when I say storytelling is about change, I think
Hmm.
that the actual moment of change is singular and oftentimes instantaneous within 5 seconds. That means that 95% of a story is essentially designed to bring that singular moment to the greatest clarity possible. Same things happens in
Right.
movies and books is eventually our protagonist has to make a decision, and that decision will be reflecting the change that they have to undergo in order to achieve or not achieve their ultimate goal. So in
Right.
life, what we're looking for is those moments when we suddenly feel something in our heart or in our mind where we have changed our mind or fallen in love or fallen out of love or realized that our parents knew more than we ever thought or realized our parents were just
Mm,
tragically human beings and not as
mm,
special as we ever thought they were. Whatever it's going to be, ultimately, I think all stories come down to a singular moment where someone has to make a choice and that choice changes them in some fundamental way. Or in business,
mm.
it's the moment when we have something new to offer a customer or a client, or we have decided to move our company in a new direction. In those singular moments, those are the stories we have to tell.
Right. So it's like getting to the peak of a mountain. You basically like do the hike to get to the peak moment, and then you kind of like take them through the path that way.
Yeah, but
Right.
most of the story is sort of the
Mm,
mountain, right? So,
mm,
Starbucks, for example, the new CEO just put out a corporate
mm,
letter. And
mm,
what he talked about was the importance of increasing throughput in the company, getting people through the line
right.
quicker because apparently it's gotten very slow. I don't drink coffee, so I'm with
Mm,
my wife often enough to see the disaster of that place.
mm.
And also the idea that I guess Starbucks have become less friendly to people who are sitting and
Yeah.
hanging out, removed a lot of seating. And
Yeah.
so this new CEO had a singular moment where he realized these two things need
Mm,
to change our company for us to continue to move forward. So his corporate letter essentially leads to
mm,
this moment of realization. Now there isn't transformation yet because the company hasn't changed. We don't have
mm,
lovely seating and he has not streamlined, the process yet. But he's had a moment of realization as a corporate leader, and
mm.
that's what the purpose of that letter is. That is the reflection of the change over
Right.
time.
Right. So it's just not always about what you communicate, but it's also like what you realize could be that change. And then you go on to communicate. And yeah, that makes sense. And it's interesting you get the Starbucks example because I remember reading Starbucks' initial story of how they started and what were their core values. And one of the things that strikingly comes to my mind now is how they wanted to cultivate this sense of community and make people attached to coffee as a form of building community, and that's the change that they wanted to bring about in their storytelling, in the brand, in the way that they wanted people to associate with the brand, to say, oh, like we build a community through coffee. So yeah.
Yeah, even the decision to do that is a story, though.
Hmm.
Even the realization that this might be an effective way of addicting millions of people,
Right.
hundreds of millions of people to a product that they will be forced to come and drink every day and somehow feel like a part of something as a
Mm.
result. As someone who doesn't drink coffee, I've never even tasted it in my life.
Mm.
I am surrounded by people for whom coffee seems to be a very popular topic of conversation. It sounds terrible to me. I think it's boring and inane to talk about a beverage, but a lot of people love talking about it. And that is the result of a company like Starbucks making a
Mm.
decision at some point, Howard Schultz at some point making the decision that this might be the way to make a lot of
Right.
money. And it turns out he was correct.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. And in this case, it shows up that the 5 second example is about the realization more than the actual story because the story came right after realizing that you need that point. So Right. It kind of like
Yes.
strikes a moment. Yeah. Um,
Oftentimes,
because
I'll say oftentimes the most
Mhm.
interesting stories are the ones we don't see. You know, it's
Mm,
the decisions we make that are the best versions of every story. The action that comes after it is almost less interesting.
mm,
It is the weighing of odds that people find most compelling. And then whatever
yeah.
you choose to do moving forward is just the result of
Mhm.
something deeply interesting, which is a person deciding a future for themselves. The outcome of that future can be interesting, but it is often not as interesting as the actual decision-making process itself.
Right. Yeah, that's a very powerful point because I guess when it comes to storytelling, it's always spoken from the front of what do you do in front of people, like what do you say and what do you write about. But in this case, it's more on the action side, and it's sometimes, like you said, very unseen, but rather the way you act and the way you make people feel, I guess, is also like a lot to do with what story you want them to leave with. Yeah,
Yes, absolutely.
true.
Yes.
That's true. So we're saying how people should recognize this moment of change. How should we kind of like connect our everyday moments? You talk about the homework for life framework, and I see this as a great way for somebody to identify, spot, and later connect the dots and come up with a story or a form of story of the realization we're talking about. So how does one get started in this path, like especially if they want to create this moment of change?
Well, we have to have stories to tell, and this person who has the
Hmm.
most stories to tell tends to be the best storyteller. They have the most they're armed the best for the world ahead. And so
Mm-hmm.
Homework for Life is a system I came up with about 15 years ago, basically
Mm-hmm.
because I was running out of stories to tell and I needed more. And so being an elementary school teacher, I tend to think that homework is the solution to a lot of problems. So I assigned myself this homework first. I think that our lives are filled with stories. I know our lives are filled with stories. The tragedy is we often just forget them or don't notice them. Or when we
Mm-hmm.
do see them, we allow them to sort of leave our lives, drift away like they're nothing. And as a result, all of this content that can be meaningful for us as human beings, as people who care about our lives and remembering our lives, but also as people who want to use stories to connect to others, to become unforgettable, to sell a product or a service, whatever we're looking to do, the more stories
Mm-hmm.
we can, the better off we're going to be. So Homework for Life is a process by which I ask people to, at the end of every day or even in the midst of the day, take note of the moments that you find the most story worthy. The prompt I actually give myself is if someone kidnapped my wife and children and they said they would
Mm-hmm.
not give them back to me unless I told a story about something that happened over the course of this particular day, what would the story be? Even if nothing really happened, that felt very story worthy. And then I write it down. I don't write the whole story down because I think that's a little
Yeah.
crazy. I use a
Yeah.
spreadsheet, 2 columns, a date, and then I stretch the B column across the screen. And in that B column, that's where I allow myself to write the story. And my
Mhm.
goal was to find one new story per month, 12 new stories per year. I would have been thrilled if that had been the result. But instead, what I've discovered is I find more stories than I can ever find time to tell. And it's not just me, tens of thousands of people all over the world now do Homework for Life. It is a process where we acknowledge our day, we start to see our day, and then eventually we start to see our day better. As our storytelling lens gets sharper,
Mm.
we start to see moments that are actually meaningful. So if I look at my 2015 Homework for Life entries, I had
Mhm.
about 1.3 entries back then per day, 1.3 moments I was noticing. And mostly it was stuff I was doing and I was looking
Yeah.
for like story. Today, or at least last year, I had 7.8 moments per day that I was capturing. Not because my life is more interesting, simply
Mhm.
because I have a sharper lens. I can see things I
Right.
used to not see. And I also know today that things that make good stories aren't necessarily things I'm doing. They can be something
Mm.
I heard, something I said, something I thought, you know, very small things make great stories. And so in 2015, I was looking for big, important things. Today, if my
Mhm.
son says something funny, I'm going to write that down. It might never be a story, or it could become a story, or it could become a part of a story. But either way, I'm going to hold on to that moment. We allow
Right.
our moments to just leave us. And then what happens is people walk around and they say things like time flies. It doesn't really
Mhm.
fly. If I asked you to recall how many days in 2022 you can actually remember, if you're really good, maybe you'll remember 100. Most won't. You might remember 50 days from 2022 with any specificity. What that means is you've taken 365 days and reduced it to 50 days. And that's why
Right.
time flies, because we shrink our years to almost nothing. And then we can't
Mm,
believe the year has gone away. If you do homework for life, you have a record of every day. You have a
mm.
meaningful moment that experienced every day. And if you're like me and you start to find 7 or 8 a day, now you can multiply 365 times 7 or 8. Time goes by very slowly for me, truly. My children are 12 and 15 and they feel 12 and 15 because I remember the moments. And if I forget something, I can go back in my homework for life and relive the year and it's right back in my heart and mind. So homework for life will give you the stories you need to tell. It'll give you more stories than you ever have had in your life. You'll see your life with more clarity and you'll slow time down. It's the most important thing that I teach.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This sounds incredible, and I think it's also making homework to be really fun, like not the ones that people would really dread about. But I guess it's like helping somebody get back to their gratitude journal, and we often have this tendency to sit back and reflect on the day and maintain a gratitude journal. To me, it sounds more like a way that helps you record your moments and maybe like how you would usually think about what are you thankful for. It's more about, hey, what was your day really like? And then, as you said, it gets better with every passing year. Like I can live that to see how this gets very, very specific and very relatable to what you do every day. And I kind of do a very photo version of this. Like when you said, how do you clock the best moments of your day and look back? I guess I've been a very visual person. I kind of like take pictures, and my memory is like always full with pictures. But I now kind of see how I can get the notes and the picture part together, because maintaining it like a collection of parts is definitely sounding great. So yeah, that's like a good framework to club that with the visual part that I usually maintain.
Yeah, the photos are great when you can include them as well. I always
Mhm,
tell people I don't like journaling because I never want you to miss a day. And if you're
mhm.
journaling, you're definitely going to skip some days. That's just too much
Yeah,
for a lot of people. So I like it to be as simple as
yeah,
brushing your teeth. And I don't like
yeah, yeah.
gratitude journals. I'm sure the gratitude journals are lovely, but I think what they do is they discount the value of struggle and strife and discord.
Mhm.
Like our lives are not simply filled with gratitude. They're filled with other things that should be acknowledged and remembered. So if you're doing a
Yes.
gratitude journal, that's great, but it's not homework for life. Homework for life is something
Mm.
very
Yeah. No, I guess you're right. Like it kind of takes. I mean, your moment of the day can also be something that kind of struggled you, or something that you
yeah,
found as something very problematic. But whatever it clocks through and made you feel, I guess it's more of a raw emotion and something that you went through, and not just the rose tinted lens of things. So yeah, it makes sense.
right.
Mark, how do you draw from these stories? Okay, so we're talking about how do we record this and how do we precisely maintain it year after year. So let's say when there's a certain moment for us, whether it's a pitch deck or whether it's a talk that we're giving or whatever, like what are the ways through which we kind of use the stories from here? Like, do you have some practices that's helped you to draw from these bank of stories?
Well, some of them I just know are stories right away. You experience something, you
Mm,
think, oh, that's going to be a story for sure. But a lot
mm,
of them, what ultimately happens is I'm looking to help someone tell a story or looking to tell a story myself. And I'm looking
mm,
to match theme, meaning, or message with the story
mm.
that I'm applying. So, I was working with a contract manager recently at a big
Right.
corporation, and
Mhm,
he needed his people to be more specific in their contracts. And so he wanted a story as a part of his 90-minute talk he was going to give to his people on
mhm,
specificity. So I asked him, do you have a moment in your life where you're overly specific? And he didn't have one. He doesn't do homework for life. I had 20 of them. So I gave him one. I said, when I go to restaurants, the problem I have is I hate pickles. I really, really hate them. And the problem with pickles is they'll put them on your plate without any warning. Like you don't order a pickle
mm.
and yet a pickle ends up on your plate.
Yeah.
And pickles sort of infect everything on a plate. If you order a hot dog and fries, but there's a pickle next to it, everything sort of tastes like a pickle, and I hate it.
Mm,
So when I go to
mm,
restaurants, whenever I order food, I say, and if you're going to put a pickle on the plate, please don't. Right.
mm.
And so even when my wife and I were having clam chowder a couple weeks ago, I said to the server, and if you're going to put a pickle on the plate, please don't. And the woman said, why would I put a pickle on a plate with clam chowder? I said, I don't know. You put it on the plate for a whole bunch of other things and you never warned me. I don't ask for it, so don't do it. My wife thinks it's a little crazy, and I do it more to be amusing in cases like that. but I am really specific about pickles because they really can ruin a meal for me. I said
Like,
to the contract manager, that's the story I would tell. And then
mm,
I'd say, I want us to be specific in the same way that I am specific about pickles in restaurants. So I asked this guy, I said, so what's your pickle story? And he said, I'm just going to use your
mm.
story. And I said, do you like pickles? He said, well, I don't like them anymore because it's too good for the story. Now, the problem is he's
Yeah.
not using homework for life. So the story is going to work well for him. But the problem is he's not actually going to be revealing anything about himself to his people, which is the value of storytelling. When we tell a
Yeah.
story about ourselves that matches the theme,
Mm,
meaning, or message, I call it speaking with adjacency, we not only
mm,
land a message, a really powerful message. In fact, I pointed out to this guy, whenever his people are in a restaurant and they get a pickle on their plate, they're going to think about his story and they're going to think about him and they're going to think about the message he sent. So it's going to be
mm.
reinforcing. But also his people, if he actually didn't like pickles, would now know something about him that they didn't know
Yeah.
before. And the more
Yeah.
we learn about someone, the more connected we get to that person. And it doesn't seem like a big deal, I don't like pickles, but that actually connects me to a whole bunch of people who also don't like pickles, and also oddly connects me to a whole bunch of people who love pickles because
Mm,
opposites also attract. So the
right.
more we reveal about ourselves through our communication, the more connected we
Mhm,
get to our audiences. When we fail to tell stories, we end up being just like everybody else, which is ultimately
mm.
forgettable.
Yeah, yeah. No, I completely agree with you. And it's like a chain of thought, right? Like where you start and slowly start connecting the other things. And it's so metaphorical though, because when you said, "Hey, what's your pickle?" I kind of looked at it like, oh, like now I have a shared narrative that I can use, and my pickle could be another story. It could be something else. But I like how it's getting to be very specific in the sense, where it's like, what could be your pickle could be my something, my dash, and it makes me kind of like think and see what matches this pattern. And you said how people could relate to this side of you, this small story of you. And I also see this as a way that people can powerfully start looking at and narrating this incident tomorrow. Like, let's say, tomorrow if there's going to be something that they would want to relate to this client, they're going to say, oh, like, it's like your pickle to me. It's like, oh, this is something that I would really not want to do because it's like what you say as a pickle. So, what's your pickle? And this is just going to get from one person to another. So, I see how the power is not just with conveying it, but also like I guess it starts to get used as what I call it, like a phrase, like something that connects people, and then eventually gets to be like a good, a thing that people would relate to eventually.
Yeah, it becomes unforgettable. Like, you know, anyone listening to this podcast, the
Hmm.
next time they see a pickle on their plate, they're going to think about this conversation and remember me, which is the goal of every storyteller, is to be remembered and then have their story retold by someone else. There will
Yeah.
be people sitting at tables
Hmm.
eating food. Pickle will arrive unannounced and they'll say, "Oh, look, it's an unannounced pickle. I heard a guy on a podcast talking about this, and it was related to contracts, right?" And so now my story is being repeated. It doesn't get repeated if that contract manager just says, "You need to be more specific with your contracts. Here's 3 ways I want you to be more specific," right? But when you actually attach it to a story, now it becomes something people want to talk about, and it gets lodged in your brain, at least for a period of time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Completely. And Matt, when we're talking about attaching stories and really bringing about these moments of relatability, I'm also curious whether there's a certain structure to a story. Because when it comes to presentations and talks, there's always this concept about, hey, what's your hook? What's your landing moment? Or is there like a pause, a surprise element? And there are like tons of those methodologies and strategies that people use. So, for a story structure, apart from the couple of points that we spoke about, is there something you think as, oh, like this makes a good structure for a story? And like the kind of whatever brings the art around it.
Well, I'll say first, I guess we should avoid too many frameworks. We don't want our stories to always sound the same every
Mm,
time or sound like everyone else's.
mhm,
So,
mm,
I teach many, many different ways to tell a story, both chronologically and structurally. So we want to avoid being repetitive. But what I do tell
mm,
people is if you're going to think about anything, think about the beginning of your story. I think
mm.
about stories as taking someone on a plane ride to a new place, right? And I used to think beginnings and endings were equally important. I don't think that anymore because if you don't get people on your plane at the beginning of your story, you're flying an empty plane to a beautiful place. And even though the ending
Mm,
might be fantastic, if no one's actually listening, it becomes pointless. And I think
true.
most stories fall apart in the beginning because we afford people the opportunity to stop listening. If
Mm,
people disengage, they can't get on our plane once we're at 30,000 feet, and that sometimes happens. It's happened to me where I'm sitting next to someone, let's say watching a television show or a movie, or someone walks into a sporting event halfway through and they want to get
mm,
caught up. They say, "Oh, what's going on here?" It makes you crazy, first of all, because you're watching something and you don't want to have to catch someone up. But you also understand, I'm never going to catch you up. If you come into the middle of a
yeah.
movie, you're never really going to get what you need in order to make the ending feel fulfilling. So we
Mm,
have to get people on board immediately. So we have to pay attention to the first 3, 5, 10, 15 sentences we speak. Those are the places
right.
grab people or we don't. And that
Mm,
means we avoid introductions. When we spend 2.5 minutes introducing a speaker before they come onto the stage, that's a disastrous way to introduce someone. Nobody cares. Nobody cares who you are once you begin speaking. Some of the best orators in the world, Barack Obama, right?
mm,
He's a fantastic speaker. But
mm,
if he's failing on stage because for whatever day he's not a fantastic speaker, his introduction means nothing to us now. He's failed, right? The fact that he was the former president of the United States does not save him if his speech sucks. And so we have to make sure we're not surviving on our
mm.
background, on our credits, on our credentials. We're surviving on the words coming out of our mouths. So we have to make sure those first few words have to be great.
Right. Yeah, that's a very interesting thought because often, like you said, we fall back to the stereotype that says, oh, like you have to tie your ending to the beginning. And that's because, people could drift away in the middle and they would come back when you tied. But I guess the plain narrative was another great form of storytelling because it just landed in my head. And the next time I'm going to think of the plain example. And it absolutely makes sense because if people are not with you in the beginning, you're just going to lose them. And yeah, it wouldn't matter if the destination is great. So, I can't help but wonder is the same strategy or the thought when it comes to telling personal stories too? Because when it's an audience, this works where we kind of say, oh, I have to ensure my audience is there with me in the beginning. But there are stories that we tell to ourselves too, right? Just as a way of uplifting or whatever the scenario could be. But we have our own narratives that go inside our heads. The same the same thing that applies to personal stories too? Or is there something else that you found work great for the personal stories?
Well, if I'm speaking a personal story out loud, I'm using all the same strategies. In fact, for the
Mm,
first 5 years of storytelling, I only told personal stories until the business
mm,
world sucked me in. I was essentially delivering speeches and telling personal stories. The
mhm,
stories we tell ourselves are really important. I often say that the most important audience we have is ourselves. Even
yeah.
if you never tell a story to anyone in the world but yourself, that's still a great thing. The tricky thing is
Mm,
when it comes to telling stories to ourselves, we're very interested all the time in ourselves.
mhm,
We don't have to worry about having a great beginning because we're the most invested audience in ourselves at all times. You never
yeah.
stop listening to yourself because you're boring. That's just not a real thing. So you don't have to worry about strategy if you're speaking to yourself. But as soon as you're speaking
Mm,
to another person, that's when
mm,
you have to recognize that they don't care about you as much as you care about yourself. You care about
mm,
yourself enormously. Your parents care about you a lot, but not as much as you care about yourself, right?
mm.
So whenever we're speaking to other people, that's when we have to worry about what people are hearing and how we're engaging and how much they care about what we're saying.
Right. So I guess for coming up with a lot of these story prompts and what really motivates us, starting as personal stories is great because we're able to identify and tell these narratives to ourselves. And then when you have to deliver, I guess understanding how it begins and what kind of structure you follow matters. So I see it as a combination of both. You start as telling stories to yourself, but then you eventually transform to telling it to an audience.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I'm also wondering if writing actually plays a role in all of this because one of the frameworks we spoke about, the homework for life, is a lot to do with writing and noting things down. And For me, I've always thought that writing is also, great only when you're able to think well and vice versa. Like it provides clarity to both thought and once you have a clear thinking is when you're able to write well. So, do you see writing as a great means to telling good stories too? I just want to hear from you your perception around this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously I love writing. I've published, 10 books. So writing
Mm,
is important to me. I
mm,
will say that when it comes to actually speaking aloud, telling a story, I've written nothing down that I actually say out loud. I've told 150 stories on stages. I've delivered hundreds of speeches. I don't write any of it down. I speak completely from an organizational framework I have in my brain, but not one that is on the page. Part of that is just I'm
mhm.
a very auditory learner and I'm not a visual learner, so I can remember
Right.
large chunks of content very, very well. I also have a lot of
Mm,
bandwidth on stage because I don't get nervous in any way. So I can sort of
mhm.
formulate things in the same way I'm formulating this conversation with you. It's not prepared. I can have the same thing on stage
Yeah.
and not be concerned about what an audience is thinking of me. But I
Mhm.
do think that if you're going to speak things out loud, it's probably a mistake to write them down word for word. Actually, it's always a mistake to write them down word for word. First, because
Mhm.
they're not going to sound as authentic and real as what your normal speech sounds like. But
Yeah.
also, unless you're reading from a teleprompter, which also sounds pretty disastrous to me, what you're doing is you're going to be memorizing to a certain degree. And when we
Mhm.
memorize, we create a chain of sentences. And when a link
Yeah.
in that chain falls away, now your chain is broken and you're often lost and you
Mm,
don't know where to go. So, I support people creating outlines of what they're going to speak. I support
mm.
people use things like I use comic book panels for people sometimes
Yeah.
where we'll actually draw pictures in each panel for visual people about what they're going to be talking about. That helps them
Mm,
remember it.
mhm.
So we're not memorizing, we're remembering. And if we can avoid writing down sentence for sentence, we're going to be a lot better off. That said, a lot of people ignore me in this regard. They do it at their own peril and they do it basically out of fear. They tell me, oh no, this
Mm,
is the way I work, Matt. But what they're really saying is, I'm afraid. I'm afraid that if I don't actually have
mm.
pretty sentences to look at, then pretty sentences won't come out of my mouth. But what I
Yeah.
tell people is we don't want perfection when we hear from a public
Yeah.
speaker. We want
Yeah.
authenticity. There's nothing wrong with umming. There's nothing wrong with pausing. There's nothing wrong with making a mistake and having to go back. There's nothing wrong with misspeaking. All of those things are fine. The disastrous part is when
Mm,
someone's speaking to us and we don't feel that it's authentic in any way. We feel like it's rehearsed, overly rehearsed, like we're in the middle of some kind of one man play and all of this is just a monologue without any real emotion attached to it. So I love writing,
yeah.
obviously. I've already written, it's early in the morning here. I've probably already written 5,000 words. But
Wow.
when it comes to speaking, I am absolutely I'm working from my brain, and most people should be working from some notes, but nothing
Mm,
that is formal or sentence by sentence.
right. Yeah. More like cues to help you pick up your stories or, get you to that chain of thought, but not something that breaks the chain of thought and helps you sort of like fumble or, gets you completely out of the picture. And in fact, it's quite interesting you spoke about the visual cues part because I wanted to get your thought on how memes or comics and a lot of what could help people gain attention to storytelling is helpful because we speak about how stand-up comedians or how people who are good storytellers use humor or memes and whatever we see today as different cues to engage the audience. So do you also believe in that tinge of humor as an element or using what we call memes and other visual cues into picture? Like what's your take on that?
Yeah, I use a lot of humor. I think
Hmm.
essentially humor is it's a beautiful tool that is not necessary but is very, very helpful. I do stand-up comedy myself, so for humor
Oh,
purposes
nice.
it comes easier for me, but everyone can be funny. People are not born funny. They learn how to be
Hmm.
funny either because they were lonely as a child and they wanted attention, or they're excellent listeners, or they studied comedy because became obsessed with it in an early age. But everyone
Yeah.
can be funny. I teach 26 strategies that you can use to be funny. So it's certainly a
Hmm.
doable thing. I think people make a mistake when they don't use any humor,
Yeah.
even in the most sober moments. When my mom passed away, I was with the funeral director 2 days later
Hmm.
planning a funeral. And, obviously it was a very difficult time for me. And in the middle of the planning of the funeral director said something funny that made me laugh. And I was so
Mm.
happy that he had done that. Despite the fact it doesn't feel like the appropriate moment, it is absolutely the appropriate moment. So I believe in humor for sure. I believe
Mm.
in even visual gags, we'll say. Steve Jobs' 2007 iPhone launch has a brilliant slide that makes everyone laugh. It's a picture of a janky iPhone that looks more like a kitchen timer. He puts it up there as a joke, to make us laugh at the right moment in that presentation. So I believe in all of those things. I
True.
especially believe in the idea that people can learn to be funny, maybe not necessarily in regular life, but
Right.
in a prepared way. They can be prepared to be funny, for a speech, for a story, for a pitch deck, even if when they go out with their friends, they're still not very funny. They can prepare to be funny. And I think that's a great tool.
Right. And like since you said like there are like so many strategies to get you started to be more vigilant of humor. Like, do you want to share one or two maybe simpler ones that somebody could just get started with? More to say, hey, I don't want to sound funny or be funny, more of an unnatural way, but something that I think I could start with to recognize and begin with good stories.
Well, they're probably using strategies right now they're not even aware of. Like exaggeration is an
Hmm.
easy strategy to use for humor.
Hmm.
My wife is Jewish and I am not. So we
Okay.
have Christmas in my home. And when my wife had her first Christmas with me 20 years ago, I let her pick out the
Hmm.
Christmas tree. And it was a terrible tree. It was a tree that only a Jewish woman could pick out. But when I describe it in the story, I tell people it was 3 feet tall and 7 feet wide. Right now, it wasn't really 3 feet tall and 7 feet wide. It was boxy, but I choose to exaggerate the dimensions
Right.
of the tree in order to produce a laugh. We do this all the time. People exaggerate constantly. Oftentimes, they're exaggerating for bad effect. But when
Hmm.
you're trying to point out something, a number, when you're trying to talk about the size of something, the frequency of something, these kinds of things, exaggeration is an easy strategy to use. One you hear
Yeah.
comics use all the time is something I call one of these things is not like the other. It's a game that used to be played on the show Sesame Street, which is essentially
Hmm.
you list three things, two are expected, and then one is unexpected. Right. So
Hmm.
my son likes to use these a lot. He might say something like, I might say, "How was your school day?" And he might say something like, "I learned a lot. The teachers were very nice to me, and the pizza made me sick." He recognizes that if he does two positive things and then a negative thing, that will possibly produce a laugh. Now, that's not the best laugh in the world, but he's 12 years old. But comedians use this all the time. They set you up by making you think you're going to hear a list of three similar things and really it ends up being two and then one that is completely different. And oftentimes, if you
Yeah.
can make it completely outside the realm that you're speaking in, it often produces a large laugh. Simple things like that can be taught
Right.
or included in speeches to make people laugh.
Yeah, yeah. Wonderful examples. And I guess when you use humor, it also makes people, I don't know, probably just happened to me right now when you said about the 3 feet, 7 feet example. I was immediately visualizing it and that produced a laugh to kind of say, oh, wow, like it was that boxy. So I guess it makes people a bit more related to what you're saying. And that's what we've been discussing right from the start of this talk. Like, how do you make people engage more with what you say and make them recognize that they're a part of the story that you're saying? So I guess humor actually makes people feel like they're just a part of what you're just narrating. And I've experienced this with stand-up comics, yes. So when you point it out, I'm just going back to see how much of this is making people relate to the story and sort of be like, hey, I'm already an audience of that story. So yeah, that's a great tactic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So I also want to understand the importance of what a lot of different media today is doing to story. Let's take something like AI generated videos or more like automated story decks and you just have to give a prompt and then you have a lot of the results that you have. So how should probably like a good storytelling look like with the advent of AI? And how does imagination match with what could still be taken as aided by AI or more like assisted by AI? What's your thought on that?
Well, I love AI because what it's going to do is it's going to make most of the people who use it sound like everyone else. And as
Mm.
a result, the only storytellers who will continue to shine are going to be the ones who are original in some way. AI can't produce anything original. It is essentially taking the culmination of human experience and then finding some median of that experience, and that is what it
Mm.
produces. And so, therefore, a storyteller like me thinks AI is fantastic because it's only going to make me sound better over time. AI can't create a pickle moment that is going to be authentic to me. It might create a pickle moment, but it will not be authentic to the person who's speaking, and therefore the
Mm,
person speaking will not become more known and relatable to the audience. AI might create a structure based upon its understanding of movies and television and film, but it's going to again
mm,
fall into those formulas that are most common in the world today. It's never going to produce a movie like Memento, which is a Christopher Nolan
yeah.
movie told in reverse order, right? AI can't
Mhm,
do that because that was done once and it probably will never be done again. So,
mm.
I think AI is wonderful if you're looking for a list of storytelling topics. I will
Yeah.
use AI sometimes if I'm thinking about putting a list into something and I can't quite think of all the
Mm,
possibilities of that list. AI can generate that list for me. It would be a list that I would have generated myself. It might have taken me two
mm.
days to do it. Instead, it takes 2 seconds. So I love that.
Yeah.
If you're asking AI to generate stories for you, you are most assuredly going to get stories that will be forgotten and will feel
Yeah.
pedestrian to most people.
Yeah, and I guess it wouldn't fall into any of what we spoke today in the episode about the real moments, about the pickle moment, the plain moment. A lot of these metaphors came because it's what we have conceived it from our own experiences, or our own imagination, I guess. So yeah, I kind of side with you there because I feel that what maybe enhances AI is human imagination. Like we use our imagination and then use AI to maybe bridge the imagination, but not completely conceive that imagination. I guess you cannot produce imagination with AI, but you can definitely like augment imagination or like make that more, like you said, the automated list example. So all of these are perhaps augmenting the imagination, but never creating the imagination in the first place. So yeah,
Right.
that makes
Yes.
sense. Yeah. Awesome. Matt, thank you so much. This was a terrific episode, and I loved what we discussed today. And a lot of the moments that you said the audience would remember, I guess I would remember it too. And the next time I'm going to be using it for something, I would come back to a lot of those metaphors we used today. So it was great understanding what I guess stories could do to both personal selves, and that's what you kind of produce with your business storytelling as well. So thank you so much for walking us through a lot of anecdotes and what you personally have learned in your career and your life. So, yes, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
For sure. And for people willing to reach out to you, where could they find you and where could they find links to your writing? Of course, the Storyworthy book is something I'm going to link in the show notes, but if you've got something to share, feel free to do so.
Sure. Well, I have a new storytelling book out for business. It's called Story Sell. It came out about a month
Hmm.
ago. So it's
Oh,
the book
nice.
that is designed specifically for business people in looking to tell stories. And then if they want to learn more about me, you can go to matthewdix.com or storyworthy.com. Both of those places you can find lots of stuff that I do.
Awesome. I'm going to link all of them in the show notes. So, yes, Matt, thank you so much once again.
Okay, thanks so much.